First class, C2B on Atlantic Airways Flight 447 from London to New York cost $12,000. For Marcus Thompson, it was supposed to be 8 hours of peace after closing the biggest pharmaceutical deal in European history. Instead, flight attendant Jennifer Walsh took one look at the young black man in the expensive suit and decided he didn't belong there. She had no idea she was speaking to the new majority shareholder of her airline's parent company. What happened next would teach everyone about respect and dignity. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 447 represented the pinnacle of luxury air travel. 12 spacious seats were arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each offering direct aisle access and complete privacy. The leather was Italian, hand-stitched, and butter-soft. The lighting was subtle and warm, designed to promote relaxation during the 8-hour transatlantic journey. Fresh orchids adorned each seat-side table, their delicate fragrance mixing with the clean scent of expensive air filtration systems. Marcus Thompson settled into seat 2B with a deep sense of satisfaction. At 34 years old, he had just concluded the most important business deal of his career. His pharmaceutical company, MedTech Solutions, had signed a licensing agreement worth $2.8 billion with 3 major European hospitals. The breakthrough cancer treatment his team had developed would now reach millions of patients across the continent. But more than the money, Marcus was proud that their research would save lives. The journey to this moment had been long and challenging. Born in Birmingham to a single mother who worked as a hospital cleaner, Marcus had earned scholarships to study biochemistry at Cambridge University. His mother, Patricia Thompson, had cleaned the very laboratories where he now conducted groundbreaking research. She had passed away 2 years earlier, but Marcus knew she would have been proud to see how far he had come while never forgetting his values. MedTech Solutions employed over 3,000 people across Europe and North America. Their research facilities in London, Geneva, and Boston were considered among the most advanced in the world. Marcus had built the company from nothing, starting in a rented garage 12 years ago with just 2 employees and a revolutionary idea about targeted cancer therapy. As he arranged his leather briefcase beneath the seat, Marcus pulled out the latest issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. The cover story featured research that his company had helped fund, a study on pediatric leukemia treatments that showed remarkable success rates. He was looking forward to 8 hours of uninterrupted reading before landing in New York to visit his daughter Sarah, who was completing her medical residency at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. The cabin began filling with the usual mix of international travelers. A distinguished elderly gentleman took seat 1A, nodding politely at Marcus before opening his copy of the Financial Times. A well-dressed woman settled into 3A, already absorbed in her tablet computer. A young couple in their 30s occupied seats 4C and 4D, speaking quietly in what sounded like German. The atmosphere was one of quiet professionalism and mutual respect. Marcus had flown first class hundreds of times over the past decade as his business grew. He was accustomed to the respectful service and peaceful environment that justified the premium price. Tonight, however, something would be different. Jennifer Walsh had been working for Atlantic Airways for 12 years, having started as a ground crew member before working her way up to flight attendant and eventually earning assignment to the prestigious first-class cabin. At 38, she took pride in her work and had received multiple commendations for customer service excellence. Her supervisor had praised her attention to detail and professional demeanor. But as Jennifer made her pre-flight rounds, checking seat assignments and greeting passengers, something about the man in 2B troubled her. She couldn't quite articulate what it was, but his presence seemed out of place in the exclusive first-class environment. Marcus was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for him. His shirt was crisp white cotton, his tie a conservative navy blue with subtle silver threads. His shoes were black Oxford leather, polished to a mirror shine. An elegant watch adorned his left wrist, and his briefcase was made of fine leather with gold-plated hardware. Every detail of his appearance suggested success and sophistication. Yet Jennifer found herself questioning whether he truly belonged in first class. The thought nagged at her as she completed her other duties, checking seat assignments and greeting passengers. Finally, she approached Marcus's seat. He looked up from his medical journal with a polite smile, expecting the standard greeting and perhaps an offer of champagne or sparkling water. "Excuse me, sir. I need to see your boarding pass." Marcus found the request unusual. Boarding passes had been checked multiple times already, at security, at the gate, and when he first boarded the aircraft. He had been seated for nearly 10 minutes without any previous questions about his documentation. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely, reaching into his jacket to retrieve the boarding pass. "I just want to make sure everything is in order," Jennifer replied, examining the document carefully. The boarding pass clearly showed his name, Marcus Thompson, seat 2B, first class, with all the appropriate stamps and codes. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. But Jennifer continued to scrutinize the boarding pass, turning it over as if looking for some hidden flaw or forgery. Her behavior was beginning to attract attention from other passengers, who glanced over with curiosity and growing discomfort. "As you can see," Marcus said calmly, "everything appears to be correct. Seat 2B, first class, my name matches my identification." Jennifer's expression tightened. She had hoped to find some discrepancy that would justify her suspicions, but the documentation was perfect. This forced her to be more direct about her concerns. "Sir, I just want to make sure there hasn't been any confusion about your ticket. Sometimes passengers receive complimentary upgrades or special accommodations, and there can be misunderstandings about the actual seat assignment." The implication was clear and insulting. Jennifer was suggesting that Marcus couldn't possibly afford a first-class ticket on his own merit and must have received some form of charity or made an error in his booking. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Despite his success, his education, and his achievements, he was still being judged solely by the color of his skin. It was a painful reminder that discrimination persisted, even in supposedly elite environments. "There's no confusion," Marcus replied, his voice remaining steady but taking on a subtle edge of authority. "I purchased this ticket with my own money, just as I assume every other passenger in this cabin has done." The elderly gentleman in 1A looked up from his newspaper with a frown, clearly disapproving of Jennifer's line of questioning. The woman in 3A had stopped reading her tablet and was watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. The German couple had ceased their quiet conversation and were staring openly at the confrontation. Jennifer realized that her behavior was creating a scene, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. Something about Marcus's quiet confidence seemed to irritate her further. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remain calm," she said, raising her voice slightly. "I'm simply doing my job and ensuring passenger safety and proper seating arrangements." The word calm was particularly galling to Marcus. He had been nothing but polite and composed throughout their entire interaction. The suggestion that he was somehow being aggressive or threatening was both false and deliberately provocative. "I'm perfectly calm," Marcus responded, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "What I am not is willing to be subjected to different standards of treatment because of your assumptions about who belongs in first class." Jennifer's face flushed red. She had expected Marcus to become defensive or apologetic, perhaps even to move to economy class to avoid further confrontation. Instead, he had calmly but firmly called out her discriminatory behavior in front of other passengers. "Sir, if you continue to be difficult, I'll have no choice but to call the captain. We have strict policies about disruptive passengers." The threat was absurd. Marcus had raised no voice, made no demands, and exhibited no behavior that could reasonably be construed as disruptive. The only disturbance in the cabin was coming from Jennifer's own conduct. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his expression becoming thoughtful. As someone who had built a successful multinational corporation from nothing, he understood the importance of choosing battles wisely and handling conflicts strategically. "By all means," he said quietly, his voice carrying a confidence that seemed to surprise Jennifer. "Please, call the captain. I believe he should hear about this conversation." Jennifer had expected him to back down when faced with the threat of involving the captain. Instead, Marcus seemed almost relieved at the prospect, as if he welcomed the opportunity to have an authority figure witness their exchange. Jennifer's confidence wavered at Marcus's calm response. She had expected him to show signs of anxiety or submission when threatened with the captain's involvement. Instead, he seemed genuinely welcoming of the prospect, as if he had nothing to hide and everything to gain from having an authority figure witness their conversation. "Fine," she said curtly, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty for the first time. "I'll get Captain Morrison right now." She turned sharply and walked toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the cabin floor with each determined step. As she passed the galley, she paused to speak with her colleague, Sarah Martinez, a newer flight attendant who had been observing the exchange with growing concern. "Sarah," Jennifer whispered urgently, leaning in close, "I need you to keep an eye on the passenger in 2B while I get the captain. He's been argumentative and non-compliant with standard procedures." Sarah glanced toward Marcus, who had calmly returned to reading his medical journal. He appeared completely relaxed and showed no signs of agitation or disruptive behavior. If anything, he seemed more composed than many first-class passengers she had observed during her 6 months with Atlantic Airways. "What procedures was he non-compliant with?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused by Jennifer's characterization of the situation. "He became defensive when I tried to verify his boarding credentials. Trust me, I've been doing this for 12 years. You develop an instinct for passengers who don't quite fit in first class. There's something off about his whole situation." Sarah remained skeptical, but nodded reluctantly. As a newer employee, she was hesitant to question Jennifer's judgment, especially given her seniority and generally good reputation within the airline. However, her own observations didn't align with Jennifer's description of events. Meanwhile, Captain David Morrison was completing his final pre-flight checks in the cockpit when Jennifer knocked on the reinforced door. At 49 years old, Morrison was a veteran pilot with over 22 years of experience flying international routes. He was known throughout Atlantic Airways for his calm demeanor, excellent safety record, and fair treatment of both passengers and crew members. "Captain," Jennifer began as she entered the cockpit, her voice carrying obvious tension, "I have a serious situation in first class that requires your immediate attention." Morrison looked up from his instrument panel, immediately noting the strain in Jennifer's voice and posture. In his years of flying, he had learned to take crew concerns seriously, as passenger disputes could escalate quickly in the confined environment of an aircraft. "What's the nature of the problem, Jennifer?" he asked, setting down his checklist and giving her his full attention. "There's a passenger in seat 2B who's being disruptive and confrontational with crew members. He became aggressive when I attempted to verify his boarding documentation, and he's refusing to cooperate with standard safety procedures. I believe he may be in the wrong seat and is becoming hostile because he's embarrassed about the mistake." Captain Morrison frowned deeply. Disruptive passengers were always a serious concern, particularly on long international flights where there were limited options for dealing with problematic behavior. However, something about Jennifer's description seemed unusual. "Has he made any specific threats or used inappropriate language?" Morrison asked, his training kicking in as he began to assess the potential security risk. "Well, not exactly threatening language," Jennifer admitted, shifting uncomfortably, "but his tone was very confrontational and dismissive. He accused me of making assumptions and seemed angry that I was simply trying to do my job properly. He has this attitude like the rules don't apply to him." Morrison's extensive experience had taught him that passenger disputes often had multiple perspectives, and the truth usually emerged somewhere between conflicting accounts. Jennifer's description seemed somewhat vague and subjective, lacking the specific details he would expect from a genuine security concern. "I'll come take a look at the situation," he said, securing his pre-flight checklist. "But Jennifer, I want you to consider whether this really requires my direct intervention. Sometimes these misunderstandings can be resolved through calm conversation and professional courtesy." As they walked toward the first-class cabin, Morrison made careful observations about the environment. The passengers appeared tense and uncomfortable. Their attention focused on seat 2B, where a well-dressed black man sat quietly reading what appeared to be a medical journal. There were no signs of any ongoing disturbance, raised voices, or aggressive behavior. Morrison approached Marcus with his most professional demeanor, drawing on years of experience in handling delicate situations. "Good evening, sir. I'm Captain Morrison. I understand there may have been some confusion regarding your seating assignment. Would you mind if we discuss the situation briefly?" Marcus looked up from his journal, immediately recognizing the diplomatic tone that suggested the captain was attempting to de-escalate a situation he might not fully understand. He had dealt with similar scenarios in business contexts and appreciated Morrison's professional approach. "Of course, Captain. I'd welcome the opportunity to clarify what actually occurred," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to high-pressure negotiations and complex problem-solving. "Excellent. May I see your boarding pass and identification, please?" Without any hesitation, Marcus reached into his jacket and produced both documents, handing them over with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. Morrison examined them carefully, noting that the boarding pass clearly indicated seat 2B, first class, and that the name matched the identification perfectly. Everything appeared to be completely in order. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison said, returning the documents, "your paperwork appears to be entirely correct. Was there some specific issue with your seat assignment or the service you received?" Marcus chose his words carefully, understanding that his response would likely determine the tone for the remainder of the flight. He had no desire to create unnecessary drama or put the captain in a difficult position, but he also felt it was important to address what had clearly been discriminatory treatment. "Captain Morrison, your flight attendant seemed to believe that I didn't belong in first class and suggested that I might be confused about my seat assignment or might have received some kind of complimentary upgrade that I didn't understand. When I politely explained that I was in the correct seat with proper documentation, she escalated the situation by threatening to involve you, implying that I was being disruptive or non-compliant." Morrison glanced at Jennifer, whose face had grown increasingly red during Marcus's calm but clear description of events. The captain's trained eye could immediately see the tension between the two individuals, and he was beginning to understand the true nature of the conflict. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced. You are clearly in the correct seat with proper documentation, and I see no evidence whatsoever of any disruptive behavior on your part." He turned to Jennifer with a stern expression that conveyed his growing displeasure. "Ms. Walsh, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." As they moved to a discreet area near the galley, Morrison's voice dropped to a serious whisper, but his tone left no doubt about his concern regarding Jennifer's conduct. "Jennifer, that gentleman is sitting exactly where he belongs, with completely valid documentation, and he's been behaving in an entirely appropriate manner throughout our conversation. What exactly made you think he didn't belong in first class?" Jennifer's composure began to crack under her captain's direct scrutiny. The question forced her to confront the uncomfortable reality that she had no legitimate reason for her suspicions other than her own unconscious bias. She had acted on assumptions based solely on Marcus's race, and they both understood the implications of that reality. "I was just trying to ensure proper procedures were followed," she said lamely, avoiding direct eye contact with her captain. Proper procedures would have involved accepting his valid boarding pass the first time he presented it,
Morrison replied firmly. What you did was create an uncomfortable and potentially discriminatory situation for a paying customer based on no legitimate evidence whatsoever. This is absolutely not the standard of service that Atlantic Airways expects from its crew members. While this private conversation was taking place, Marcus had returned to his reading, though he remained peripherally aware of the intense discussion happening nearby. The other first-class passengers were also clearly aware that something significant was occurring, and several had begun to engage him in supportive conversation. Dr. William Chen, the distinguished elderly gentleman in seat 1A, leaned slightly toward Marcus. "I want to apologize for what you just experienced," he said quietly but firmly. "That treatment was completely inappropriate and unprofessional." Marcus looked up with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for saying that, Dr. Chen. Unfortunately, it's not an entirely uncommon experience, even in environments where you wouldn't expect such behavior." "Well, it certainly should be uncommon," Dr. Chen replied with obvious conviction. "I am a professor of ethics at Oxford University, and I can tell you that what just occurred was a clear example of discriminatory treatment. You handled it with remarkable grace." "I appreciate that observation. May I ask what brings you to New York?" "I'm delivering a lecture series at Columbia University on ethical decision-making in professional environments. Rather timely topic, given what we just witnessed. And yourself?" "I'm visiting my daughter, Sarah. She's completing her medical residency at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital." Dr. Chen's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "How wonderful! A medical family. And what field are you in professionally?" "Pharmaceutical research and development. We focus primarily on treatments for rare diseases and various forms of cancer." "That's incredibly important work," Dr. Chen said with obvious admiration. "The world desperately needs more people dedicated to healing and advancing medical science." Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Morrison's return. The captain's expression was serious but professional as he addressed Marcus directly, wanting to ensure that the situation was properly resolved. "Mr. Thompson, I want to offer you my personal apology for the misunderstanding that occurred. Ms. Walsh has acknowledged that her concerns were completely unfounded, and I want to assure you that this type of treatment absolutely does not reflect the values or standards of Atlantic Airways." Marcus appreciated the captain's directness and obvious sincerity. "Thank you, Captain Morrison. I accept your apology graciously. Is there anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable? We could arrange complimentary meal service, upgrade your beverage options, or address any aspect of your travel experience." "That's very thoughtful, but entirely unnecessary. I simply want to enjoy a peaceful flight so I can visit my daughter in New York." The captain nodded with evident respect for Marcus's reasonable response. "Of course, and please know that if you experience any further issues during the flight, you can contact me directly through the crew." He handed Marcus his business card. "I take matters of this nature extremely seriously." As the captain prepared to return to his duties, Marcus made a decision that would prove to have significant consequences for everyone involved. "Captain, might I have a brief private word with you?"
"Certainly, Mr. Thompson." They moved to the same discreet area near the galley where Morrison had just confronted Jennifer. Marcus withdrew his own business card from his wallet and handed it to the captain. Morrison's eyes widened noticeably as he read the elegant, embossed text. "Marcus Thompson, Chief Executive Officer, MedTech Solutions." "MedTech Solutions," Morrison repeated slowly, recognition dawning in his voice. "You're the company that developed the new leukemia treatment that's been featured in all the medical journals recently." "Among other research projects, yes," Marcus replied with characteristic modesty. "But more relevant to our current situation, Captain, is the fact that my company maintains significant business relationships with Global Aviation Holdings, your parent corporation." Captain Morrison felt his stomach drop as the full implications of the situation became crystal clear. MedTech Solutions was one of Europe's largest and most successful pharmaceutical companies, with annual revenues exceeding $3 billion. They regularly chartered private aircraft for executive travel and maintained substantial corporate accounts with major airlines worldwide. If Marcus Thompson was indeed who he claimed to be, then Jennifer Walsh had just discriminated against one of their most important potential corporate clients. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison said carefully, choosing his words with extreme caution, "I want you to understand that Miss Walsh's behavior in no way represents our company's actual values or established policies. We have very strict guidelines about treating all passengers with equal respect and dignity, regardless of their background." "I'm confident that you do, Captain," Marcus replied thoughtfully, "and I genuinely appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation. However, I think it's important for your management team to understand exactly what transpired here today, not solely for my personal benefit, but for the sake of other passengers who might not have the resources or position to address such discriminatory treatment effectively." Marcus's words were measured and completely devoid of any vindictive tone. He showed no signs of anger or desire for revenge. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned about preventing similar incidents from occurring in the future and protecting other travelers from experiencing discrimination. "I completely understand your concern," Morrison replied. "Would you be willing to provide a written statement describing what occurred? I can guarantee that it will reach the highest levels of our organization and will be taken very seriously." "I'd be happy to provide such a statement, but, Captain, I want to be absolutely clear about something important. I'm not interested in seeing Miss Walsh's employment over this incident. People can learn from their mistakes if they're given the opportunity and proper guidance. What I am genuinely interested in is ensuring that Atlantic Airways takes meaningful, concrete action to prevent discrimination against other passengers in the future." Captain Morrison was genuinely impressed by Marcus's maturity and grace in handling such an unpleasant situation. In his years of flying, he had encountered many passengers in similar circumstances who would have been demanding immediate retribution, threatening lawsuits, or insisting on maximum punishment for the offending crew member. Instead, Marcus was focused entirely on constructive change and preventing future discrimination. "That's an extraordinarily generous attitude, Mr. Thompson. I can promise you that this incident will be thoroughly reviewed by our management team, and we'll implement whatever training programs or policy changes are necessary to prevent similar situations." As they concluded their private conversation, Jennifer watched nervously from her position near the galley. She could observe the captain's increasingly deferential body language and posture, and she instinctively knew that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the situation. When Captain Morrison approached her afterward, his expression was grave, and his tone left no room for misinterpretation. "Jennifer, I need you to fully understand the seriousness of what just transpired. Mr. Thompson is the Chief Executive Officer of MedTech Solutions, one of Europe's largest and most successful pharmaceutical companies. His business operations have significant connections and relationships with our parent corporation, Global Aviation Holdings." Jennifer's face went completely pale as the reality of her actions hit her with full force. She had not only engaged in discriminatory behavior against an innocent passenger, but had potentially damaged Atlantic Airways' relationship with a major corporate client worth millions of dollars in potential business. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's precisely the point, Jennifer," Morrison replied with controlled intensity. "You shouldn't need to know someone's job title, wealth, or social status to treat them with basic human respect and dignity. Every single passenger who boards this aircraft deserves to be treated professionally and courteously, regardless of their race, background, or any other personal characteristic." The captain's words stung deeply because she knew they were absolutely true. She had acted purely on prejudice and unconscious bias, and now she was facing the serious consequences of her discriminatory choices. "What happens to me now?" she asked, fearfully, understanding that her career might be in jeopardy. "Right now, you're going to complete this flight with absolute professionalism and courtesy. You're going to treat Mr. Thompson and every other passenger on this aircraft with the respect and dignity they deserve. And when we land in New York, you're going to participate fully in whatever review process our management deems appropriate for this situation." Morrison's tone left absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. Jennifer nodded silently, finally understanding that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own personal discomfort or embarrassment.
As Atlantic Airways Flight 447 prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had undergone a remarkable transformation. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into an opportunity for meaningful dialogue and reflection. Marcus had returned to his seat, but rather than isolating himself with his medical journal, he found himself engaged in thoughtful conversations with fellow passengers who had witnessed the discriminatory incident. Dr. William Chen, the Oxford ethics professor, proved to be particularly engaging company. Their initial exchange about Marcus's daughter had blossomed into a wide-ranging philosophical discussion about prejudice, justice, and the responsibility of individuals to address discrimination when they encounter it. "You demonstrated remarkable restraint in that situation," Dr. Chen observed, as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. "Many people would have responded with justified anger or demanded immediate consequences for such treatment." Marcus considered the comment thoughtfully. "I've learned over the years that anger, while often justified, rarely produces the kind of positive change that actually prevents similar incidents from occurring in the future. Responding with dignity and clear communication tends to be more effective than reacting purely emotionally." "That's a valuable lesson, and one I often try to convey to my students. I frequently tell them that how we choose to respond to injustice reveals as much about our own character as the original injustice reveals about the character of those who perpetrate it." Their philosophical discussion was overheard by other passengers, gradually transforming the confined space of the first-class cabin into an informal forum on ethics, discrimination, and social responsibility. What should have been an uncomfortable, intense flight environment had become an opportunity for meaningful dialogue and mutual learning. Amanda Foster, the well-dressed woman in seat 3A, leaned forward to join the conversation. "I have to admit, I was incredibly uncomfortable watching what happened to you, Mr. Thompson, but I wasn't sure whether it was appropriate for me to intervene or speak up." Marcus nodded with understanding. "That's a common dilemma, and there's no single correct answer. Sometimes direct intervention can escalate a situation, but there are always ways to show support. Even something as simple as making eye contact or offering a kind word afterward can make a difference." "I wish I had said something," Amanda admitted with obvious regret. "As a white woman, I have certain privileges in situations like that, and I feel like I should have used them to support you." The honest vulnerability of her admission created space for even deeper conversation. Hans and Greta Mueller, the German couple in seats 4C and 4D, shared their own experiences witnessing discrimination in their home country and their struggles with knowing how to respond effectively. "In Germany, we have a particular sensitivity to the dangers of remaining silent in the face of injustice," Hans said quietly. "Our history teaches us that ordinary people's failure to speak up can enable terrible things to happen." As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, these conversations continued and deepened. Marcus found himself sharing stories from his journey building MedTech Solutions, including the challenges he had faced as a young black entrepreneur trying to secure funding for his research. "The irony," Marcus explained, "is that some of the same investors who initially dismissed my ideas based on prejudiced assumptions about my capabilities are now eager to partner with MedTech Solutions because of our success. But I try not to focus on vindication.
I'm more interested in using our platform to create opportunities for other underrepresented researchers and entrepreneurs. Dr. Chen was fascinated by this approach. You're describing what we might call constructive transformation rather than retributive justice. Instead of seeking to punish those who wronged you, you're working to change the systems that enabled the discrimination in the first place. Exactly, Marcus agreed. Punishment might provide temporary satisfaction, but systemic change creates lasting impact. That's why I didn't want Miss Walsh to lose her job over this incident. I'd rather see her receive proper training and become part of the solution. Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh was experiencing the most difficult flight of her 12-year career. The weight of her actions and their potential consequences pressed down on her as she attempted to perform her duties with the professionalism Captain Morrison had demanded. Every interaction with passengers felt magnified, every decision scrutinized through the lens of her discriminatory behavior toward Marcus. Sarah Martinez, her junior colleague, had initially been confused by Jennifer's characterization of Marcus as problematic. Now, having observed the aftermath and overheard snippets of the passengers' conversations, she was beginning to understand the true nature of what had occurred. "Jennifer," Sarah said quietly as they prepared the meal service, "I've been thinking about what happened earlier. That passenger in 2B wasn't being difficult at all, was he? He was just responding to being treated unfairly." Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she arranged items on the service cart. "I don't want to talk about it right now, Sarah. I just need to get through this flight." But Sarah pressed gently. "I think it's important to talk about it. I'm new to this job and I need to understand what went wrong so I don't make similar mistakes. You told me he was being argumentative, but everything I observed suggested he was just standing up for himself." The direct question forced Jennifer to confront the uncomfortable reality of her actions. "I made a mistake, a big mistake. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated a passenger poorly because of it."
"What kind of assumptions?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jennifer was silent for a long moment, struggling with the shame of articulating her prejudice out loud. "I saw a young black man in first class, and instead of seeing a successful professional who had earned his seat, I immediately assumed he didn't belong there. I questioned his documentation and his right to be in that section of the aircraft based on nothing more than the color of his skin." The honest admission hung in the air between them, painful but necessary. Sarah appreciated Jennifer's candor while recognizing the seriousness of what had occurred. "How do we make sure something like this doesn't happen again?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Jennifer replied honestly. "I thought I wasn't prejudiced. I thought I treated all passengers equally. But clearly I have unconscious biases that I need to address. I'm going to need help figuring out how to do that." As the flight progressed, Marcus continued to engage with his fellow passengers, but he also took time to work on his written statement for Captain Morrison. He wanted to be thorough and factual, documenting exactly what had occurred while maintaining a constructive tone that focused on solutions rather than blame. His statement read, in part, "I want to emphasize that while Ms. Walsh's behavior was clearly discriminatory and unprofessional, I believe this incident represents an opportunity for learning and growth rather than simply punishment. I would recommend that Atlantic Airways implement comprehensive bias training for all crew members, establish clear protocols for addressing discrimination complaints, and create systems for ongoing education about respectful treatment of all passengers, regardless of their background, destination, or any other personal characteristics." Dr. Chen, who had been asked to review the statement as a witness to the events, was impressed by its balanced and forward-thinking approach. "This is exactly the kind of response that can create meaningful change," he told Marcus. "You're not just addressing this specific incident, you're proposing solutions that could benefit countless future passengers."
As they began their descent toward New York, Captain Morrison made an announcement over the intercom that was clearly influenced by the evening's events. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. I also want to take a moment to remind everyone that our airline is firmly committed to providing excellent service to all passengers, regardless of their background, destination, or any other personal characteristics. We believe that respect and dignity should be fundamental aspects of air travel, and we will continue to work diligently toward that goal every single day." The announcement resonated throughout the aircraft, and Marcus appreciated Captain Morrison's effort to transform a negative situation into a teaching moment for everyone on board. As Flight 447 touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Marcus reflected on the evening's unexpected events. The incident with Jennifer had been unpleasant and unnecessary, but it had also led to meaningful conversations with fellow passengers and created an opportunity to address discrimination in a constructive way that might prevent similar experiences for other travelers. Captain Morrison made a point of personally seeing Marcus off the aircraft, shaking his hand with genuine respect. "Mr. Thompson, thank you once again for your patience and understanding throughout this situation. I want to assure you that your written statement will be reviewed by our senior management team within 24 hours, and we will implement appropriate changes to our training and policies." "I appreciate your commitment, Captain Morrison. I hope this incident can serve as a catalyst for positive change within your organization." As Marcus walked through the jet bridge toward Customs and Immigration, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. In a few hours, he would be reuniting with his daughter Sarah, sharing not just the story of discrimination he had experienced, but also the example of how grace, dignity, and constructive dialogue could transform even difficult situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. Behind him, Jennifer Walsh faced an uncertain future. She knew that her actions had been wrong and that consequences would follow. But perhaps if she was willing to engage in the difficult work of examining and changing her unconscious biases, she could emerge from this experience as a better person and a more professional flight attendant. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when Atlantic Airways management would have to decide how to respond to this incident and what it revealed about their company's commitment to equality and respectful treatment of all passengers. 3 days later, Marcus received a phone call from Elizabeth Hartwell, the Chief Executive Officer of Global Aviation Holdings, Atlantic Airways' parent company. Hartwell had read his written statement and Captain Morrison's incident report with growing concern about the implications for their organization. "Mr. Thompson, I want to offer you my personal apology for the discriminatory treatment you experienced on our aircraft. Such behavior is completely contrary to our company's values and policies, and I want to discuss concrete steps we're taking to address this situation." "I'm glad to hear from you, Ms. Hartwell. What actions are you considering?"
First, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all flight crews, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and diversity experts. Second, we're establishing a new position, Director of Passenger Equity, to oversee these initiatives and handle discrimination complaints. Third, we're revising our crew evaluation criteria to include assessments of respectful passenger treatment. Those sound like meaningful changes, Marcus acknowledged. What about Ms. Walsh specifically? Ms. Walsh is being suspended pending completion of intensive bias training and cultural sensitivity education. If she successfully completes the program and demonstrates genuine understanding of the issues involved, she'll be eligible for reinstatement with ongoing supervision. We believe in second chances when people show genuine commitment to change. Marcus was pleased with this balanced approach. I think that's fair. People can learn from their mistakes if they're given proper guidance and support. 6 months later, Marcus was invited to speak at Atlantic Airways' annual employee conference about his experience and the importance of respectful customer service. Jennifer Walsh, who had completed her training and returned to work under supervised conditions, was in the audience. After his presentation, Jennifer approached him with obvious nervousness but also genuine determination. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior on that flight was inexcusable, and I want you to know that I've spent these past months doing serious work to understand and address my unconscious biases. I can't undo what happened, but I can commit to doing better in the future." Marcus looked at her with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout their original encounter. "I appreciate your apology, Ms. Walsh, and I'm glad to hear about your commitment to personal growth. That's what I hoped would come from this experience. I want you to know that your gracious response to my discriminatory behavior probably saved my career and certainly changed my life. I'm a better person and a better professional because of how you handled that situation. We all have the capacity for growth and change. I'm glad you've used this experience as an opportunity for self-improvement." As Marcus left the conference that day, he reflected on the long journey from that uncomfortable flight to this moment of reconciliation and growth. Discrimination remained a persistent problem in society, but incidents like this proved that individuals and organizations could change when confronted with their biases and given the tools to do better. His daughter, Sarah, now Dr. Sarah Thompson, and practicing pediatric oncology in New York, often told her patients' families about her father's approach to handling adversity with grace and using difficult experiences as opportunities for positive change. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the confines of an aircraft cabin and into the broader challenge of building a more just and respectful society for everyone. 1 year after the original incident, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. Atlantic Airways was launching their new Dignity in Travel initiative, a comprehensive program designed to ensure respectful treatment for all passengers. They wanted him to serve as the program's inaugural spokesperson and advisory board chairman. The launch event was held at the Atlantic Airways headquarters in London, attended by airline executives, diversity experts, and civil rights leaders from across Europe and North America. Marcus stood before the assembled crowd, reflecting on how far everyone had traveled since that uncomfortable evening in first class.
"When I boarded Flight 447 over a year ago," Marcus began, "I expected a routine business trip. What I experienced instead was discrimination that could have ended in bitterness and division. Instead, through honest dialogue and genuine commitment to change, we've created something positive that will benefit countless travelers for years to come." In the audience, Jennifer Walsh listened intently. She had volunteered to share her own story as part of the program, describing her journey from unconscious bias to becoming an advocate for respectful customer service. Her transformation had been difficult but genuine, involving months of education, self-reflection, and community service with civil rights organizations. "I want to tell you about the passenger who changed my life," Jennifer said when called to speak. "Not because he demanded punishment or revenge, but because he showed me that people can grow when treated with dignity, even when they don't deserve it. Mr. Thompson could have destroyed my career with one phone call. Instead, he chose to help me become a better person." The audience included Maria Santos, a young Latino business executive who had experienced similar discrimination on a different airline 6 months earlier. Unlike Marcus, she had not received an apology or seen any policy changes result from her complaint. Atlantic Airways' new program gave her hope that the aviation industry might finally be taking these issues seriously. Dr. Chen, who had become a close friend and advisor to Marcus since their flight together, spoke about the ripple effects of choosing constructive responses over destructive ones. What we witnessed that evening was a masterclass in transformative leadership. Marcus didn't just solve his own problem, he created solutions for problems that other passengers hadn't even reported yet. The program's concrete initiatives were impressive in their scope and specificity. Every crew member would complete 40 hours of bias training annually.
Passenger complaint procedures were streamlined and standardized. Most importantly, Atlantic Airways committed to publishing annual diversity and inclusion reports, making their progress transparent and accountable to the public. Captain Morrison, who had been promoted to Chief of Flight Operations partly based on his professional handling of the original incident, announced the creation of a passenger advocate position on every long-haul flight. These specially trained crew members would be responsible for ensuring that all passengers felt welcomed and respected throughout their journey. We learned that good intentions aren't enough. We need systems, training, accountability, and leadership committed to making respectful treatment a reality, not just a policy statement. The financial impact of these changes had been significant, but positive for Atlantic Airways. Their customer satisfaction scores had improved dramatically, particularly among minority passengers who had historically rated the airline poorly for service quality. More importantly, their corporate relationships had strengthened as companies increasingly chose to partner with businesses that demonstrated genuine commitment to equality and inclusion. Marcus's own company, MedTech Solutions, had expanded their corporate travel relationship with Atlantic Airways, routing millions of dollars in business travel through the airline annually. But the relationship went deeper than financial transactions. Atlantic Airways now sponsored MedTech's scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing careers in medical research. During a private moment at the launch event, Marcus spoke with Thomas Hartwell, Elizabeth Hartwell's son, who served as Vice President of Customer Experience for Global Aviation Holdings. Thomas had been instrumental in implementing the new policies and had personally overseen Jennifer's rehabilitation process. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that your response to that incident has influenced how our entire company approaches customer service failures. We don't just fix problems anymore. We ask ourselves how we can use each complaint as an opportunity to improve our systems for everyone. That's exactly the kind of institutional change that creates lasting impact, Marcus replied. Individual apologies are important, but systemic improvements prevent future incidents from occurring in the first place. 6 months later, Atlantic Airways published their annual Dignity in Travel report, documenting a 73% reduction in discrimination complaints and a significant increase in positive feedback from passengers of all backgrounds. Jennifer Walsh was featured in the report as an example of how education and commitment could transform individual behavior. The program's success attracted attention from other airlines, and soon Marcus found himself consulting with aviation companies across 3 continents, helping them develop their own anti-discrimination initiatives. What had begun as a single unpleasant flight experience had evolved into a movement that was changing industry practices worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the relationship that had developed between Marcus and Jennifer. They met quarterly to discuss the program's progress, and she had become one of its most effective advocates. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes publicly and describe her learning process had helped other crew members recognize and address their own unconscious biases. I used to think I was a good person who just made a mistake. Now I understand that being a good person requires constant work, education, and willingness to examine your assumptions about others. That flight changed my entire approach to treating people. 2 years after the original incident, Marcus received a letter from a young black businessman named David Williams, who wrote to thank him for the changes at Atlantic Airways. David had flown first class from London to Boston and had been treated with perfect professionalism and respect throughout his journey. I don't know if my flight would have gone as smoothly 2 years ago, but I want you to know that your willingness to turn a negative experience into positive change made my trip comfortable and dignified. Thank you for fighting not just for yourself, but for all of us who come after you. Marcus shared the letter with Sarah during their regular video call. She had completed her residency and was now working as a pediatric oncologist at Boston Children's Hospital, using some of the treatments that her father's company had helped develop.
"Dad, I'm proud of how you handled that situation, but I'm even more proud of what you've built from it. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You created something that helps people you'll never meet." That's the real measure of success, not just overcoming the obstacles in your own path, but making the path smoother for those who follow. As Marcus looked back on the journey from that uncomfortable evening on Flight 447 to the industry-wide changes that had resulted, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to transform a negative experience into lasting positive impact. It reminded him why he had gone into pharmaceutical research in the first place, the belief that individual actions, when guided by principles and sustained by commitment, could heal and improve the world around them.